Blake Thompson stared at his reflection in the mirror, adjusting his bolo tie with trembling fingers. Today was his wedding day, but there were no congratulatory slaps on the back, no champagne toasts, no joy, just the weight of family obligation, pressing down on his shoulders, and the knowledge that he was marrying a complete stranger, a woman he'd only seen once from across a crowded room, her face partially concealed behind a decorative mask that his father had casually mentioned hid her unfortunate condition. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A business arrangement, his father had called it, in the same tone he used when discussing cattle futures or land acquisitions. The Prescott Ranch has the water rights we need, and old man Prescott's going soft in his twilight years. I want to see his daughter taken care of before he passes. Blake had protested, argued, and finally threatened to leave the family business altogether. But Harrison Thompson didn't build the largest cattle empire in West Texas by backing down from a fight. "You'll do this, son," he had said, steel in his voice, "for the family, for our legacy." And so here Blake stood, about to bind his life to a woman they called Scarred Ellie, a nickname he'd overheard from gossiping ranch hands when they thought he wasn't listening. But what happened next would shake the foundations of everything. Blake thought he knew about family, loyalty, and the true nature of beauty. The Thompson estate sprawled across 5,000 acres of prime Texas rangeland, its white colonial-style mansion visible for miles around. Inside that mansion, 28-year-old Blake Thompson stood in his childhood bedroom, now feeling like a stranger in his own home. The custom-tailored black suit felt restrictive, the air conditioning insufficient against the August heat that seemed to radiate from within him rather than without. A knock at the door preceded his father's entrance. Harrison Thompson filled the doorframe with his imposing presence, 6'3", broad-shouldered even at 62, with a full head of silver hair and eyes as sharp and calculating as they'd been in his prime. "You're looking proper," Harrison said, his version of approval. "The Prescotts will be here soon." Blake met his father's gaze in the mirror. "We haven't discussed terms." Harrison's eyebrow ticked upward. "Terms? For this arrangement?" Blake turned to face his father directly. "If I'm sacrificing my future for Thompson cattle, I want something in return." A smile played at the corner of Harrison's mouth, the same smile he wore when closing a particularly advantageous deal. "I'm listening. After the wedding, I want full control of the eastern expansion. No oversight, no weekly reports. My project, my way." Harrison studied his son for a long moment before extending his hand. "Deal." Blake shook it, feeling not triumph, but resignation. The Eastern Expansion project had been his passion for years. Sustainable grazing practices, modernized equipment, a model for what cattle ranching could be in the 21st century. Now it would be his consolation prize for an unwanted marriage. "And father," Blake added, dropping his hand, "after today, don't expect me to play the loving son at your dinner parties anymore. This arrangement costs me more than it costs you." Harrison's face hardened. "You think I don't know about sacrifice? I built this empire from nothing. Everything I've done has been for the family," Blake finished. "I know. You've said it enough times." The doorbell's chime echoed through the house, saving them from further conversation. Harrison straightened his own tie. "That'll be them. Come downstairs in 5 minutes." When the door closed behind his father, Blake turned back to the mirror. The man who stared back at him looked like a stranger, not the ranch manager who could ride for hours checking fence lines, who slept under the stars during cattle drives, who earned the respect of every hand on the payroll by working alongside them. This man looked trapped, cornered. He'd never understood his father's obsession with legacy, with expanding their holdings beyond what any family could reasonably manage. Thompson cattle already spanned 3 counties. The Prescott water rights Were valuable, yes, but not worth selling his son's future. 5 minutes later, Blake descended the grand staircase to find his father conversing with Miles Prescott in the foyer. Prescott was a wiry man in his 70s, his skin weathered from decades under the Texas sun, his handshake still surprisingly strong. "Blake," Prescott nodded in greeting. "Been looking forward to this day. Your father speaks highly of you." "Mr. Prescott," Blake returned politely, noticing the absence of the bride-to-be. "Is your daughter not joining us? Eleanor's in the drawing room with the Reverend and your mother." Girls understandably nervous. Prescott's expression softened slightly. "She's had a tough road. Appreciate you giving her this chance." Blake swallowed the bitter retort that sprang to mind. It wasn't Prescott's fault, not really. The old rancher was dying, pancreatic cancer according to local gossip, and worried about his daughter's future. In his generation, marriage was still the surest protection a father could arrange for his daughter. The drawing room fell silent when Blake entered. Reverend Morgan stood by the fireplace, Bible in hand, looking uncomfortable in the formal setting. Blake's mother Caroline sat on the settee, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and designer dress, creating an image of aristocratic refinement she'd cultivated since marrying into the Thompson fortune. And beside her sat a woman in a simple white dress, her face partially concealed by an ornate half-mask decorated with small pearls and crystals. "Eleanor Prescott, Blake." His mother rose gracefully. "Come meet your bride." Eleanor stood as he approached, and Blake was struck by her posture, straight-backed, chin raised despite the mask that covered the left side of her face from forehead to cheekbone. She extended her hand, not in the passive gesture of a woman, expecting her hand to be kissed, but in the firm greeting of an equal. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice surprisingly melodic. "Thank you for accommodating my father's wishes." Blake took her hand, noting its strength and the calluses that spoke of work, not the manicured softness he expected. "Miss Prescott, it seems we're both accommodating our fathers today." A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps appreciation. For his honesty showed in her visible eye, a striking hazel that appeared almost amber in the room's lighting. "Shall we proceed?" Reverend Morgan asked, clearly eager to complete the uncomfortable ceremony and escape the tension filling the room. The wedding itself was brief, a sterile exchange of vows before the necessary witnesses, with no music, no flowers, no celebration. Blake found himself studying Eleanor throughout, trying to glimpse the person beneath the formal responses and the mask. She was tall, nearly reaching his 6-foot height, with chestnut hair pulled back into an elegant knot. Her visible features were pleasant enough, straight nose, well-formed lips, strong jawline, but it was the alertness in her eye that intrigued him. She wasn't a passive participant in this arrangement. Something more complex was at work behind. That mask. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Blake hesitated before the customary kiss. Eleanor solved the dilemma by offering her hand instead. He took it, feeling oddly grateful for her pragmatism. "Congratulations," Harrison declared as signatures were affixed to certificates. "Miles, why don't we handle the property transfers?" "In my study. Caroline, perhaps you could show Eleanor to her room." "Actually," Blake interrupted, "I thought I'd show my wife around the property." He emphasized the word wife slightly, watching his father's reaction. "Since this is her home now," Harrison looked momentarily nonplussed, but recovered quickly. "Of course, the paperwork can wait until dinner." "If that's agreeable to you," Blake said to Eleanor, suddenly realizing he was making assumptions. "I'd like that," she replied, her visible eye studying him with open curiosity. Once outside, Blake led them not toward the manicured gardens, but toward the working part of the ranch, the stables, the equipment barns, the staff housing. The August heat enveloped them immediately, but Eleanor showed no discomfort despite her formal attire. "Not the typical wedding day tour," she observed as they walked. I thought you might appreciate seeing the substance of the place rather than the show parts, Blake replied. Since we're not pretending this is a typical wedding day. Eleanor's laugh surprised him, genuine and warm. Direct, aren't you? That's refreshing after months of people tiptoeing around everything. They reached the main stable, where the scents of hay, leather, and horses created a familiar perfume that had always scented Blake more than any meditation practice could. Riley, the stable manager, looked up in surprise from where he was adjusting a saddle. Boss, didn't expect you today of all. His words faltered as he noticed Eleanor, his eyes flicking to her mask before he recovered. Mom, congratulations on your wedding day. Thank you, Eleanor replied, stepping forward without hesitation. Do you mind if I meet some of these beautiful animals? Riley glanced at Blake, who nodded. Course not, ma'am. This here's Thunderbolt, Mr. Blake's personal mount. Spirited fella but gentle once he knows you. To Blake's surprise, Eleanor approached the stall confidently, speaking softly to the large chestnut quarter horse, who immediately extended his nose toward her. She stroked his muzzle with evident experience. He's magnificent, she said, looking back at Blake. Do you ride often? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Every day, when I'm not traveling, Blake admitted. Do you ride, Mrs. Thompson? The name felt strange on his tongue. I practically grew up on horseback, she replied, continuing to stroke Thunderbolt, though our operation is smaller than yours, more focused on breeding than beef production. Blake leaned against the stable wall, reassessing his new wife. You work your family's ranch? Since I was 16, she confirmed. Much to my father's initial dismay, he had more traditional aspirations for me. Riley, sensing the personal turn of conversation, excused himself to other duties. When he was out of earshot, Blake asked the question that had been pressing on his mind. Why did you agree to this arrangement, Eleanor? You don't seem like someone who would accept being traded for water rights. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her attention seemingly focused on Thunderbolt. My reasons are my own for now, Mr. Thompson. But I assure you they're substantial. She turned to face him directly. I hope you'll extend me the same courtesy I'm extending you, not assuming this is simply about obedience to a father's wishes. The statement hung between them, a declaration of boundaries that Blake found himself respecting despite his frustration at the non-answer. Fair enough. And please, call me Blake. Then I'm Ellie, she replied. Only my father calls me Eleanor, usually when he's displeased with me. They continued the tour, the conversation flowing more easily than Blake had anticipated. Ellie asked intelligent questions about the operation, made observations about the differences in their ranching approaches, and showed particular interest in Blake's eastern expansion project when he mentioned it. Rotational grazing makes so much sense, she said, as they walked the perimeter of fields that would soon be subdivided into more sustainable paddocks. Dad always said it was too labor-intensive, but the long-term benefits to both the land and the cattle seem worth the investment. That's exactly my argument, Blake agreed, surprised by her knowledge. The initial setup costs are substantial, but within 3 years, we should see improved soil health, better forage quality and healthier. Cattle requiring fewer antibiotics. Have you considered incorporating sheep as companion grazers? Ellie asked. They prefer different forage than cattle, which can help with weed control and further improve pasture diversity. Blake stopped walking, studying her with new interest. I have, actually. There's a section in my proposal about multi-species grazing as a Phase 2 implementation. He paused. How do you know so much about this? Ellie smiled, the expression transforming her visible features. Agricultural science degree from Texas A&M, with a focus on sustainable livestock management. Did my father and yours neglect to mention that in their negotiations? A startled laugh escaped Blake. They certainly did. My father described you as... He hesitated, suddenly embarrassed. As what? Ellie's voice had an edge now. The scarred spinster daughter. The burden needs to be settled before dear old Dad passes on. When Blake didn't immediately respond, she nodded. That's what I thought. They walked in silence for several minutes, approaching a ridge that overlooked much of the Thompson property. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape, the cattle in the distance appearing as dark specks against golden grassland. I'm sorry, Blake finally said. This whole situation is not what either of us would have chosen. Ellie's posture softened slightly. No, it isn't, but we're here now. She gestured toward the view. And there are worse places to be. Blake found himself studying her profile, the masked side turned away from him. May I ask about... He gestured vaguely toward the mask. The reason I'm wearing this. Ellie's hand moved reflexively toward the mask before dropping away. Not yet. I'm not ready for that conversation. All right, Blake nodded, respecting her boundary. But you should know, whatever is beneath that mask doesn't change who you've shown yourself to be today. Ellie turned to face him fully, studying him with an intensity that made him want to look away but found he couldn't. That's a nice sentiment, Blake. I hope you mean it. As they made their way back toward the main house, something shifted subtly between them. Not friendship exactly, but perhaps the beginning of an alliance. They were both pawns in their father's final power play, but neither was as powerless as those fathers believed. Dinner was a tense affair, with Harrison and Miles exchanging satisfied glances as they discussed the water rights transfer and expanded grazing access, as if the newlyweds weren't present. Caroline made polite but distant conversation with Ellie, clearly uncertain how to relate to this unusual daughter-in-law. Will you be removing the mask for the meal, dear? Caroline eventually asked during an awkward pause. No, Mrs. Thompson, Ellie replied pleasantly. I've adapted to eating with it. Blake noticed how deftly she maneuvered her fork and glass, minimizing the mask's interference. Years of practice, he realized. After dinner, Miles Prescott announced he would be returning to his own ranch. Got an early start tomorrow, he explained, kissing his daughter's cheek, the right, unmasked side. You'll be fine here, Eleanor. The Thompsons are good people. Blake watched Ellie's composed farewell to her father, noting the complexity in her expression, love tinged with something harder to define. When Miles had departed, Harrison raised his whiskey glass. To new beginnings and stronger futures, he toasted. Blake, I've had the East Wing prepared for you and your bride. Caroline touched Ellie's arm lightly. I've had your things moved to the blue suite. I hope you'll find it comfortable. Thank you, Ellie replied, then turned to Blake with a question in her eyes. Blake understood the unspoken communication. Mother, father, it's been a long day. If you'll excuse us. As they climbed the stairs toward the East Wing, Blake sensed Ellie's increasing tension. In the hallway outside the blue suite, he stopped. You should know that I don't expect, he began awkwardly. I appreciate that, Ellie cut him off. This marriage may have been arranged, but I'm not surrendering my autonomy, Blake nodded. I understand. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be an adjustment for both of us. Ellie's hand was on the doorknob when she paused. Blake, thank you for today, for treating me like a person, not a transaction. You are a person, Blake replied simply. A surprisingly interesting one. That earned him a small smile before she disappeared into her room. Blake continued down the hall to what had once been his childhood bedroom, now converted to a master suite. As he loosened his tie and sank into an armchair, he found himself more intrigued than resentful for the first time since his father had announced this arrangement. Who was Eleanor Prescott Thompson? What was she hiding? Not just beneath the mask, but behind her careful responses and controlled demeanor. And why would an educated, capable woman agree to this archaic arrangement? As Blake drifted towards sleep, one certainty formed in his mind. Whatever game was being played here, he was missing crucial pieces of information. Tomorrow, he would begin discovering what they were. Blake woke before dawn, a habit ingrained from years of ranch work. For a moment he forgot the previous day's events until memory rushed back. The ceremony, the mask, the woman now sleeping down the hall, who was legally his wife. He dressed quickly in work clothes rather than the business, attire his father preferred. If he was going to navigate this new reality, he needed the comfort of routine, the physical demands of ranch work to clear his head. The kitchen was quiet when he entered, but Lisa, the housekeeper who had been with the Thompsons for 20 years, was already preparing coffee. "Morning, Lisa," Blake greeted her, reaching for a mug from the cabinet. "Mr. Blake," she acknowledged with a nod, then hesitated. "I set out 2 breakfast trays. Wasn't sure if you'd want to eat with Mrs. Thompson." Privately, the title sounded foreign to his ears. Mrs. Thompson was his mother, not the stranger he'd married yesterday. "Just mine for now. I'm heading out to check the south pasture fencing." Lisa nodded, relief evident in her expression. The household staff was clearly as uncertain about the new arrangement as he was. Blake had just finished his coffee when movement in the doorway caught his attention. Ellie stood there, dressed not in what he'd expected, perhaps a robe or nightgown, but in jeans, boots, and a practical button-down shirt. The mask was still in place, though a simpler version than yesterday's ornate one. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear in the quiet kitchen. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Lisa turned, surprise evident on her face before she schooled her expression. "Mrs. Thompson, I was just about to bring your breakfast upstairs." "That's very kind, but unnecessary," Ellie replied with a smile. "I'm used to early mornings, and I prefer to eat in the kitchen if that's all right." Lisa glanced at Blake, who nodded. "Of course, Ma'am. What would you like?" "Whatever's easiest. Coffee and toast is fine." Blake studied his wife as she moved confidently into the kitchen. There was none of yesterday's ceremonial stiffness in her manner now. "I'm checking fencing in the south pasture," he found himself saying. "Would you like to join me, get a better sense of the operation?" Surprise flickered across the visible portion of Ellie's face, followed by what looked like genuine pleasure. "I'd like that, if you're sure I won't be in the way." "Bring her back for lunch, Mr. Blake," Lisa interjected. "Your father wants to discuss the press announcement at noon." Blake suppressed a groan. Of course, Harrison would want to publicize the merger of the Thompson and Prescott interests through his son's marriage. Everything was business to Harrison. Thompson. 30 minutes later, they rode side by side across the dew-dampened grassland, morning mist still clinging to the low areas. Blake on Thunderbolt, Ellie on a gentle mare named Daisy that she had immediately bonded with in the stable. "You really do ride well," Blake observed, as Ellie easily kept pace with him. "Told you," she replied, a hint of challenge in her voice. "I can probably outride you on a good day." "Is that so?" Blake couldn't help smiling at her confidence. "We'll have to test that theory sometime." They reached the south pasture fence line, where several sections had been damaged in a recent storm. Blake dismounted and began examining the posts. Ellie, joining him without being asked. "Hand me those wire cutters," he asked, gesturing to the saddlebag on Thunderbolt. Ellie retrieved them, then watched his technique for a moment before saying, "I can help. This would go faster with 2 people." Blake paused, assessing her. Women who offered to help with fence repair were rare in his experience. "All right. You've done this before?" "Since I was 12, she confirmed, taking a pair of gloves from her own pocket. Dad couldn't afford as many ranch hands as he needed. They worked in companionable silence for nearly an hour, falling into a rhythm that spoke of Ellie's experience. Blake found himself impressed by her strength and precision. She was clearly no dilettante playing at ranch work. "Can I ask you something?" he finally said as they moved to the next damaged section. Depends on the question, Ellie replied, wiping sweat from her brow with her forearm, careful not to disturb the mask. The farm, science degree. Why come back to ranching afterward? Most people with those credentials end up in research or corporate agriculture. Ellie considered the question as she knelt to secure a wire to a post. I love the land, she said finally. Not the abstract idea of it, but this specific land, these specific animals, the rhythm of seasons, the problem-solving, even the hard parts. She glanced up at him. You understand that, don't you? Otherwise you'd be in an office in Dallas, not out here fixing fence lines yourself. Blake nodded, struck by how accurately she'd read him. My father never understood that. He sees the ranch as an asset, a business to be optimized and expanded. I see it as a living thing, Ellie finished for him. Something to work with, not just extract from. Exactly. Blake helped her to her feet, their eyes meeting in a moment of genuine connection. Which makes me wonder even more why you agreed to this arrangement. You could have found work on any ranch in Texas with your qualifications. Ellie's expression closed slightly. The Prescott Ranch is more than just land to me. It's home. And sometimes protecting home requires compromise. Before Blake could press further, the distant sound of an approaching vehicle drew their attention. A cloud of dust marked the approach of his father's distinctive black truck. Speak of the devil, Blake muttered. Harrison Thompson pulled up beside them, surveying their work with a critical eye before exiting the vehicle. Didn't expect to find you out here, he directed at Ellie, making no effort to hide his surprise at her work clothes and dirty gloves. Mrs. Thompson was kind enough to assist me, Blake replied before Ellie could. She's quite knowledgeable about ranch operations. Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. Is she now? Well, I need you both back at the house. The Chronicle reporter will be there in an hour for the announcement. What announcement? Blake asked, though he already knew. Your marriage, of course. It's significant news, the union of two of the county's oldest ranching families. Harrison turned to Ellie. You'll want to clean up, I'm sure. Caroline has some appropriate outfits if you need something more suitable. Blake felt Ellie stiffen beside him, her posture straightening as if preparing for battle. Thank you, Mr. Thompson, but I have my own clothes. I'm sure they'll be perfectly adequate. Harrison's gaze lingered on her mask. And will you be wearing that for the photographs? Father, Blake warned, stepping slightly forward. It's all right, Ellie said calmly. Yes, Mr. Thompson, the mask stays. If that's a problem for your press coverage, I'm afraid you'll have to manage without my presence. Harrison's jaw tightened, but he merely nodded curtly. 1 hour, he reminded them before returning to his truck. When the dust from his departure had settled, Blake turned to Ellie. I'm sorry about that. Don't apologize for him, Ellie replied, removing her gloves. I've had a lifetime of people reacting to the mask. I'm used to it. That doesn't make it right. Ellie studied him for a moment. No, it doesn't. But it's reality. She gathered Daisy's reins. We should head back. The ride to the house was quieter than their outbound journey, a new tension hanging between them. Blake found himself angry on Ellie's behalf, but also increasingly curious about what lay beneath the mask and the careful composure she maintained. At the house, they parted ways to prepare for the press meeting. Blake showered quickly and changed into the outfit his mother had predictably laid out for him. Press slacks, a button-down shirt, and a sport coat that projected the image of a modern rancher rather than a cowboy. When he descended to the formal living room, his parents were already there, his mother fussing with flower arrangements while Harrison reviewed notes for his statement. The tension in the room was palpable. Is this really necessary? Blake asked. A simple announcement in the paper would suffice. This merger deserves proper attention, Harrison replied without looking up. The Chronicle reaches the entire region. This positions Thompson cattle as the dominant force in central Texas ranching. This merger, Blake repeated, emphasizing the word. Not my marriage. Harrison finally met his son's gaze. Your marriage is the vehicle for the merger. Don't pretend. It's anything else. And what about Ellie in all this? Have you considered how this spotlight might affect her? Eleanor Prescott agreed to the terms, Harrison dismissed. Miles assured me she understands her role. Blake was about to respond when Ellie herself appeared in the doorway, and the words died in his throat. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her figure, her hair arranged elegantly around her mask, a new one in deep blue with subtle silver embroidery that matched her outfit perfectly. She looked poised, beautiful, and utterly composed. Mrs. Thompson, Caroline rose, clearly relieved that Ellie had chosen appropriate attire. You look lovely. Thank you, Ellie replied politely, then turned to Harrison. Mr. Thompson, before the reporter arrives, I'd like to clarify something. I understand this is primarily a business announcement, but it's also ostensibly about a marriage. Blake and I should present a united front. Harrison's expression remained impassive. What are you suggesting? Simply that Blake and I should both speak, albeit briefly. The reporter will expect to hear from both of us. Ellie's voice was calm but firm. Otherwise, the story becomes about a business deal rather than a marriage, which could raise unnecessary questions. Blake watched his father calculating, reassessing Ellie as she stood her ground. Finally, Harrison nodded. A brief statement from each of you, then. Nothing controversial. Of course, Ellie agreed, then glanced at Blake with the slightest hint of a smile. Blake moved to stand beside her, lowering his voice. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do, she replied quietly, for reasons that go beyond today. Before he could question her further, Lisa appeared to announce the reporter's arrival. What followed was a carefully choreographed performance. Harrison expounding on the historic significance of the union between the Thompson and Prescott ranches, Caroline providing warm but vague comments about welcoming Ellie to the family, Blake offering practiced responses about honoring ranching traditions while looking to the future. When it came to Ellie's turn, she surprised them all with her poise and eloquence, speaking about agricultural sustainability and the responsibility of stewardship that both families shared. She avoided any mention of her mask, though Blake noticed the reporter's eyes continually darting toward it. Mrs. Thompson, the reporter finally asked, if you don't mind my asking, the mask is an unusual choice. Is there a story behind it? A brief silence fell over the room. Caroline looked mortified, Harrison irritated. Blake was about to intervene when Ellie responded with remarkable composure. There is indeed a story, she said pleasantly, but it's a personal one, not relevant. And to today's announcement, I'm sure you understand that some things remain private, even in a public marriage. The reporter looked chastened, but pressed on. Of course. But our readers will be curious about the new Mrs. Thompson. Can you share anything about yourself, your background, your interests? I hold a degree in agricultural science from Texas A&M, Ellie replied. My interests include sustainable ranching, practices, horse breeding, and modernizing traditional operations. I hope to bring those perspectives to my role here at Thompson Cattle. Blake watched his father's expression shift from irritation to calculating interest at this revelation. The reporter, meanwhile, scribbled furiously, clearly not having expected such credentials from what she had probably assumed was a trophy wife. The interview concluded with photos, carefully staged shots of Blake and Ellie standing together. On the porch, with the ranch stretching behind them, formal poses with Harrison and Caroline in the living room, and finally, at the reporter's insistence, a shot of just the newlyweds. Could you, maybe, the photographer gestured vaguely toward Ellie's mask. The mask stays, Blake said firmly before Ellie could respond. My wife's appearance is not up for negotiation. The photographer looked startled but quickly recovered. Of course, just a standard request for clearer facial expressions. Throughout the awkward moment, Blake felt Ellie's hand tighten slightly on his arm, not in distress, he thought, but in gratitude. When the reporter and photographer finally departed, Harrison immediately retreated to his study with a terse comment about checking cattle futures. Caroline excused herself to oversee lunch preparations, leaving Blake and Ellie alone in the formal living room. "Thank you," Ellie said quietly, "for what you said to the photographer." Blake shrugged. "It was the truth. Your choices aren't up for public discussion. Still, most people wouldn't have—" She trailed off, moving to look out the large window that overlooked the front grounds. "This isn't easy for anyone involved." Blake joined her at the window. "You handled it well. Better than I expected." "You mean better than the scarred, sheltered spinster should have been able to?" There was no bitterness in her tone, just a wry observation. "That's not what I meant. But it's what you thought yesterday, isn't it?" She turned to face him directly. "Before you knew me," Blake considered denying it, then opted for honesty, "I didn't know what to think. My father presented this as a charity case almost, a favor to your father." Ellie laughed softly, the sound surprising in its genuine amusement. "Harrison Thompson doesn't do favors without significant return. On investment." She studied Blake for a moment. "You really don't know, do you?" "Know what?" She seemed about to answer when Lisa appeared in the doorway. "Lunch is served in the garden room when you're ready." "Thank you, Lisa. We'll be right there," Blake replied, frustration building at the interrupted conversation. When they were alone again, he turned back to Ellie. "Know what?" Ellie shook her head slightly. "Not now. After lunch, perhaps we could ride out to the eastern boundary. See this expansion project you're planning?" Blake recognized the deliberate change of subject, but decided not to push. "All right, but this conversation isn't over." "No," Ellie agreed softly. "It's just beginning." Lunch was a stilted affair, with Caroline making valiant attempts at normal conversation while Harrison periodically checked his phone, barely disguising his impatience to return to work. Blake noticed how seamlessly Ellie managed to eat despite the mask, taking small, careful bites and keeping her face slightly angled away from direct observation. "I understand you've been showing Eleanor the property," Caroline ventured. "What do you think of our ranch?" "It's impressive," Ellie replied diplomatically. "Different from Prescott land in many ways, but beautiful." "Blake tells me you have an agricultural science degree," Harrison interjected, his tone making it clear this information had only recently come to his attention. "Miles never mentioned that." "Dad prefers to emphasize different aspects of my marketability," Ellie said, a hint of steel beneath her pleasant tone. Education wasn't high on that list. Harrison studied her with new interest. "What was your focus?" "Sustainable grazing systems and drought-resistant forage development." Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "Interesting. Perhaps you should sit in on our next management meeting. Might have some useful perspectives." Blake nearly choked on his water, having never heard his father invite an outsider, much less a woman, to a management meeting in all his years at the ranch. "I'd appreciate that opportunity," Ellie replied calmly, as if such invitations were commonplace. After lunch, true to his word, Blake took Ellie to see the eastern expansion. They rode across terrain that gradually changed from the well-maintained pastures of the core Thompson property to rougher land that had been recently acquired. "This is it," Blake explained, as they reached a ridge overlooking several hundred acres. "We purchased this last year from the Martinez family. Good water, sources, but it needs significant work to reach its potential." Ellie dismounted, surveying the landscape with a professional eye. "The soil quality varies significantly," she observed. "You'll need different strategies for each zone." "That's the plan," Blake agreed, impressed by her immediate grasp of the challenges. dividing it into management zones based on soil and water access. Ellie walked a few paces, bending to examine the native grasses. There's potential here. With the right approach, this could be more productive than your current grazing lands within 5 years. They spent the next hour discussing specific strategies: water, retention techniques, forage selection, grazing rotation schedules. Blake found himself engaged in the most stimulating professional conversation he'd had in months, Ellie's knowledge complementing his own in unexpected ways. As the afternoon sun began its westward slide, they sat in the shade of a lone oak tree, sharing water from Blake's canteen. The easy flow of professional discussion had broken down some of the barriers between them, creating a strange comfort neither had anticipated. "Why did you really agree to this marriage, Ellie?" Blake finally asked, returning to the question that had been nagging at him. "And don't tell me it was just to honor your father's wishes. You're too independent for that." Ellie was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the landscape. "There's something you should know about the Prescott Ranch," she finally said. "Something your father knows, but you apparently don't." Blake frowned. "What's that?" "It's not just the water rights that make our land valuable." She turned to face him directly. "6 months ago, geological surveys confirmed what my grandfather always suspected. There's oil on Prescott land, a significant deposit that extends under the aquifer." Blake stared at her, processing this revelation. "Oil, that would be worth millions, possibly billions." "Yes," Ellie nodded. "Which makes the question not why I agreed to this marriage, but why your father wanted it so badly." She paused, watching understanding dawn on his face. "The water rights were just the beginning. This merger gives Thompson Cattle potential access to those mineral rights if they're developed." "But why would your father agree to essentially give away that future wealth? Even to secure your future?" Ellie's hand moved unconsciously toward her mask. "Because he believes no one else would have me, and because he doesn't know I'm aware of the oil deposit. The survey results came to me first, and I kept them to myself." Blake's mind raced with implications. "So you agreed to this marriage, knowing about the oil, while letting your father think he was securing your future before he died?" "I agreed to this marriage to protect the land," Ellie corrected firmly. "If word got out about the oil before proper environmental safeguards were in place, the damage to the aquifer and surrounding ecosystem could be catastrophic." She held his gaze steadily. "I needed time and resources to ensure any development happens responsibly. Resources the Prescott Ranch doesn't have, but Thompson Cattle does. And you didn't think to just tell me this before the wedding?" "Would you have believed me? Or would you have assumed I was trying to escape the arrangement?" Ellie challenged. "I needed to understand what kind of man you are first. Whether you could be trusted with this information." Blake felt a complex mixture of emotions: admiration for her strategy, irritation at being manipulated, and a growing respect for the intelligence behind those thoughtful eyes. "And what have you decided? Can I be trusted?" A small smile played at the visible corner of Ellie's mouth. "I'm telling you now, aren't I?" As the Texas sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and deep purples, Blake and Ellie rode back to the main house in contemplative silence. The revelation about the oil deposits had shifted something fundamental between them. They were no longer just two people trapped in an arrangement, but potential allies in a complex game where neither fully understood all the players or rules. "My father will expect me at dinner," Blake finally said as they approached the stables. "But afterward, we need to talk more about this. The implications are significant," Ellie finished. "I know. There's more you need to understand." Riley emerged from the stable to take their horses, his eyebrows rising slightly at their dusty appearance and serious expressions. "Good ride, Mr. Blake, Mrs. Thompson." "Very informative," Blake replied, helping Ellie dismount. though she clearly didn't need assistance. The brief touch of her hand on his shoulder felt different now, less formal, more purposeful. "Take good care of Daisy," Ellie told Riley, patting the mare's neck affectionately. "She's a magnificent animal." "Yes, ma'am. She seems to have taken to you already." Blake noticed the genuine warmth in Riley's voice. The staff were already adapting to Ellie's presence, responding to her evident knowledge and respect for the work they did. It was a stark contrast to how they had received his mother years ago. Caroline had always remained Mrs. Thompson to them, never quite bridging the gap between the household and the working ranch. Dinner was a quieter affair than lunch, with Harrison uncharacteristically subdued as he discussed market projections and recent equipment purchases with Blake. Caroline maintained polite conversation with Ellie about the household management and local social obligations the Thompsons maintained. "There's the Chamber of Commerce dinner next Thursday," Caroline mentioned. "As the newest Thompson, you'll be expected to attend, Eleanor." Blake noticed Ellie's slight stiffening at both the use of her full name and the assumption of her attendance. "I'm sure the business community is curious about our new partnership," she replied carefully, "but perhaps Blake and I should discuss our social calendar privately." Caroline looked momentarily taken aback, unaccustomed to having her social planning questioned. "Well, certainly, but the RSVPs are due tomorrow." "We'll let you know in the morning, Mother," Blake interjected, surprising himself with his support of Ellie's position. Typically, he simply acquiesced to his mother's social orchestrations to avoid conflict. Harrison looked between them with narrowed eyes, clearly noting the unified front. "The chamber dinner is important for business relationships," he stated. "I expect both of you there." "We understand its importance," Ellie replied before Blake could speak. "We'll certainly take that into consideration." Blake suppressed a smile at the diplomatic non-answer that somehow managed to neither agree nor openly defy his father. Harrison, unused to such subtle resistance, merely grunted and returned to his meal. After dinner, Harrison retreated to his study with brandy and his tablet, while Caroline excused herself to make phone calls. Blake caught Ellie's eye and tilted his head slightly toward the back terrace. She nodded almost imperceptibly and followed him through the French doors into the warm evening air. The terrace overlooked carefully manicured gardens that eventually gave way to the natural Texas landscape beyond. High-end outdoor furniture created comfortable seating areas, currently lit by subtle landscape lighting that cast a warm glow over the space. "My father doesn't know that you know about the oil," Blake said once they were seated, keeping his voice low despite being outdoors. "He thinks he's manipulating both you and your father." "Yes," Ellie agreed, "and it's essential he continues to believe that for now." "Why? Why not confront him directly?" Ellie leaned forward slightly, her visible eye intent. "Because once he knows I'm aware of the deposit's value, the power dynamic shifts. Right now, he believes he's dealing with a naive rancher's daughter who accepted this marriage out of desperation. That perception gives me room to maneuver." Blake studied her with new appreciation. "You're playing a long game." "I have to," she replied simply. "The deposit extends under the main aquifer that feeds both our ranches and 3 neighboring properties. Improper extraction could contaminate water that thousands of cattle and several communities depend on. But responsible development is possible with the right approach and investment," Blake continued her thought, "which requires capital that Prescott Ranch lacks, but Thompson Cattle has in abundance." "Exactly," Ellie nodded. "My father refused to even consider exploring the possibility because of the environmental risks. He's old school, believes ranching is the only honorable use of the land. But with his cancer progressing, you needed to secure a position where you could influence how that land is managed after he's gone," Blake finished, the pieces falling into place. including who holds the mineral rights and how they're developed. The marriage merger puts me in that position, especially since your father doesn't realize I know what's really at stake. Ellie's hand moved to her mask in what Blake now recognized as a habitual gesture when she was thinking deeply. The question now is, where do you stand? The directness of the question caught Blake off guard. You're asking if I'm with you or my father in this? I'm asking if you care about doing this right, protecting the water, the land, and the people who depend on both while still developing resources that could benefit everyone involved. Her gaze was steady, evaluating. Or if profit is the only consideration that matters, as it seems to be for Harrison. Blake felt the weight of the moment, understanding that his answer would define not just his relationship with Ellie, but the future of both their legacies. The Eastern Expansion Project is about sustainable practices, because I believe responsibility to the land comes first, he said finally. Profit that destroys what we're meant to steward isn't profit at all. It's theft from future generations. Something shifted in Ellie's expression, a softening around her visible eye, perhaps relief. Then we might actually make this work. This being a partnership, she said simply. Your father forced this marriage, thinking he was acquiring control of assets neither of us knew the true value of. But what if instead we created something neither of our fathers anticipated? A genuine alliance, Blake mused, finding the idea surprisingly appealing. Using the combined resources of both ranches to demonstrate that responsible development and ecological stewardship aren't mutually exclusive. It would mean standing up to your father, Ellie warned. Harrison Thompson doesn't strike me as a man who easily relinquishes control. Blake laughed without humor. That's the understatement of the century. He's been the unchallenged emperor of Thompson cattle for 4 decades. And yet, Ellie observed, he gave you complete control of the Eastern Expansion. That suggests he respects your capabilities, even if he doesn't always agree with your methods. The observation was perceptive, highlighting a dynamic Blake himself often overlooked in his frustration with his father's domineering approach. It was my condition for agreeing to this marriage, he admitted. But you're right, he wouldn't have agreed if he didn't trust my judgment on some level. A comfortable silence fell between them as night fully descended, the stars emerging with the spectacular clarity only possible far from city lights. The situation remained complicated, the future uncertain, but Blake felt something he hadn't expected, hope that this forced union might evolve into something meaningful. There's something I need to ask, he said finally, something I've been wondering since yesterday. Ellie's posture tensed slightly. The mask. Not what's beneath it, Blake clarified quickly. That's your story to share when or if you choose. But how long have you worn it? It seems so integrated into your life. Ellie's hand rose unconsciously to touch the edge of the mask. Since I was 16, she replied after a moment. 12 years now. And no one questions it? In college or professional settings? People always question it, she said with a hint of weariness. They just don't always do so directly. I became adept at deflection, at redirecting attention to my work rather than my appearance. It helped that I excelled academically, gave people something else to focus on. Blake nodded, understanding better now her composure during the press interview. You've had a lot of practice handling public scrutiny. Necessity is an excellent teacher, Ellie replied with a slight smile. Though I admit marriage puts me in a new category of visibility I'm still adjusting to. For what it's worth, Blake said carefully, I think you handled the reporter better than anyone could have expected. Even my father was impressed, though he'd never admit it. High praise indeed, Ellie laughed softly. Speaking of your father, he'll be wondering why we're out here having such an extended conversation on our second day of marriage. The implication hung in the air between them, bringing a sudden awareness of their unusual situation. Legally married strangers, now conspirators in a plan neither had anticipated yesterday. Let him wonder, Blake decided, but you're right. We should continue this conversation somewhere more private. The study in the East Wing is rarely used by anyone but me. They made their way through the house, nodding politely to Caroline, who watched them pass with poorly concealed curiosity. The East Wing study was Blake's personal retreat, bookshelves filled with agricultural texts and environmental science journals, rather than the hunting trophies and business biographies that dominated his father's study. This feels more like you, Ellie observed, taking in the space with evident appreciation. The rest of the house has your mother's influence, but this room is the one place I don't have to be Harrison Thompson's son, Blake finished. Just myself. Ellie moved to examine the bookshelves, running her fingers along the spines. Holistic Management by Alan Savory. Dirt to Soil by Gabe Brown. You've been studying regenerative agriculture for some time. Since college, Blake confirmed. Though my father dismisses most of it as impractical idealism. Yet he gave you control of the Eastern expansion, Ellie reminded him, selecting a book and paging through it. Perhaps he's more open to new approaches than you give him credit for. Or he's letting me experiment on a relatively small portion of the ranch to prove it won't work on a large scale, Blake countered, pouring 2 glasses of water from a carafe on his desk. Harrison doesn't relinquish control without a strategic purpose. Ellie accepted the water with a thoughtful nod. Like father, like son. What does that mean? Just that your condition for this marriage, control of the Eastern expansion, shows similar strategic thinking. She smiled slightly, which is encouraging, given what we're up against. Blake conceded the point with a rueful smile. So what's our next move? We can't exactly keep having secret strategy sessions without raising suspicions. We don't need to, Ellie replied, seating herself in one of the comfortable leather chairs. As newlyweds, we have every reason to spend time together. Even better, we have legitimate professional collaboration on the Eastern expansion as cover for our discussions. While we develop a plan for the oil deposit, Blake nodded, appreciating her forethought. But there are still variables we can't control. Your father's health, for one. Ellie's expression sobered. The doctors give him 3 to 6 months. When he passes, his ownership stake in Prescott Ranch transfers to me, including the mineral rights. That's when your father will likely make his move to consolidate control, and we need to be ready before that happens, Blake concluded, with a comprehensive plan for sustainable development that's too compelling to dismiss. Exactly. One that addresses environmental protections, profit sharing with affected neighbors, and community benefits. Ellie leaned forward, clearly in her element, discussing strategy and planning. The key is to have everything in place before Harrison realizes I know about the oil. Blake found himself admiring not just her intelligence, but her passion and ethical compass. This was no simple business arrangement for Ellie. It was a mission to protect something she deeply valued. Why did you trust me with this? He asked suddenly. You took an enormous risk telling me about the oil. I could have immediately told my father. Ellie considered him thoughtfully before answering. The way you spoke about the land yesterday and today, not as a possession, but as a responsibility. The respect you show your workers, how you defended me to the photographer without hesitation. She paused. Small things that reveal character. I've learned to be observant over the years. Something warm and unexpected unfurled in Blake's chest at her words. The feeling of being truly seen and understood, perhaps for the first time in years. There's something else you should know, Ellie continued, setting down her water glass. About my father's condition and his motivations for this arrangement. I'm listening. The cancer has affected his cognitive function in recent months. His decisions haven't always been sound. Ellie's voice held carefully controlled emotion. When your father approached him about the merger through marriage, Dad was having a particularly difficult week. I'm not certain he fully comprehended what he was agreeing to. Blake frowned. Are you saying my father took advantage of your father's diminished capacity? I'm saying Harrison Thompson is a shrewd businessman who recognized an opportunity and seized it, Ellie replied diplomatically. I don't know if he was aware of the extent of my father's cognitive decline. But you went along with it anyway, Blake observed. Why not contest it, especially if your father wasn't fully competent to make such arrangements? Because by the time I fully understood what had been arranged, I had also received the geological survey results. Ellie's gaze was steady. Fighting the marriage would have meant revealing why the Prescott land was suddenly worth fighting for, which would have exposed the oil discovery before I had any protections in place. Blake nodded slowly, the complex chess game she'd been playing becoming clearer. So you chose to sacrifice your freedom to protect the larger goal? I wouldn't call it sacrifice, Ellie corrected him. Strategic compromise, perhaps. And now that I know you better, not as much of a compromise as I initially feared. The compliment, delivered so matter-of-factly, caught Blake by surprise. Before he could respond, a knock at the study door interrupted them. Lisa's voice called through, Mr. Blake, your father is asking to see you in his study. Blake exchanged a glance with Ellie. Tell him I'll be there in 5 minutes, Lisa. Yes, sir. When Lisa's footsteps had receded, Ellie stood. He's probably wondering why we're closeted away together. Let him wonder, Blake said, standing as well. But you're right. I should go. We don't want to raise suspicions this early. We'll continue tomorrow, Ellie agreed. Perhaps you could show me the financial projections for the Eastern expansion. That would give us a legitimate reason to spend time reviewing documents and discussing plans. Blake nodded, appreciating her practical approach. Good idea. Meet me here after breakfast. As they left the study together, Blake found himself hyper-aware of Ellie's presence beside him, the subtle scent of her perfume. Something clean and herbal rather than flowery, and the confident way she moved. Their marriage might have begun as a business transaction, but it was rapidly evolving into something far more interesting. Harrison was waiting in his study, a glass of expensive bourbon in his hand and a satisfied expression on his face that immediately put Blake on alert. You wanted to see me? Blake asked, remaining standing rather than taking a seat. The Chronicle article will run tomorrow, Harrison replied, sliding a tablet across his desk. They sent an advance copy. Take a look. Blake picked up the device and scanned the article. The headline read, Ranching Dynasties Unite Thompson-Prescott Marriage Signals New Era in Texas Agriculture. The piece was largely as expected. Glowing descriptions of both families' histories, quotes from the interviews, and strategic emphasis on the business implications of the union. What caught Blake's eye, however, was the careful framing of Ellie's mask as an elegant signature accessory rather than addressing any disfigurement or injury. The reporter had gone out of her way to portray Ellie as mysterious and sophisticated rather than damaged. Surprisingly good coverage, Blake commented, keeping his tone neutral as he returned the tablet. The reporter was more respectful than I expected. I may have had a word with the editor before publication, Harrison admitted with a self-satisfied smile. Suggested that the Thompson cattle advertising budget could increase or decrease depending on the tone of the article. Blake felt a flash of anger at his father's manipulation, but kept his expression impassive. I see. And was that before, or after you arranged this entire marriage without consulting me? Harrison's smile faded. I thought you'd moved past that grievance. You're getting the Eastern Expansion project, aren't you? And Eleanor seems more suitable than anticipated. Her agricultural knowledge could be quite useful." "That's not the point," Blake replied, carefully channeling his frustration toward the known issue rather than revealing what he'd learned about the oil. "You made a life-altering decision for me without my input, treating me like an asset rather than your son." Harrison sighed, setting down his bourbon. "Someday you'll understand, Blake. Business and family can't always be separated when you're responsible for an operation of this size. I did what was necessary to secure Thompson Cattle's future, your future, by using me as a bargaining chip. By creating an alliance that benefits everyone involved," Harrison corrected. "The Prescotts needed security for their daughter and their legacy. We needed the water rights and additional acreage. You needed a push towards settling down and thinking about the next generation of Thompsons." He leaned forward. "Sometimes the best decisions aren't the ones that feel good at the moment." Blake studied his father, seeing the absolute conviction in Harrison's eyes. The man truly believed he'd done the right thing, not just for the business, but for his son. In his own domineering way, Harrison Thompson thought he was being a good father. "I should get back to Ellie," Blake said finally, choosing not to continue an argument neither would win. "We were discussing the Eastern Expansion project." Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "Already talking business with your bride? That was quick." "She has relevant expertise," Blake replied evenly, "and since you've made her my wife, I might as well benefit from her knowledge." A pleased expression crossed Harrison's face. "That's the pragmatic thinking I like to see. Make the best of the situation." "Good night, Father," Blake said, turning to leave before his expression could betray his thoughts. "Blake," Harrison called as he reached the door, "I know this isn't how you would have chosen to start a marriage, but give it time. You might find Eleanor Prescott brings unexpected value to Thompson Cattle and to your life." Blake nodded, without commenting, closing the door behind him with careful restraint. His father had no idea just how accurate that prediction might prove to be, though not in the way Harrison intended. As Blake walked back toward the East Wing, his thoughts were filled with the complexities of his new situation. 24 hours ago, he had been a reluctant groom, marrying a stranger out of family obligation. Now he was a co-conspirator with that same woman, planning to challenge his father's authority and remake both their inherited legacies. And somewhere, amid the strategic discussions and revealed secrets, Blake had begun to genuinely like Ellie Prescott Thompson, her intelligence, her courage, her principles. The mask that had initially seemed the most notable thing about her now barely registered in his awareness. What remained to be seen was whether they could truly trust each other when the stakes inevitably rose higher. For now, their interests aligned, but Blake had learned through years of watching his father's business dealings that alliances could fracture when tested by pressure or opportunity. As he neared Ellie's door, he paused, tempted to knock and continue their conversation. But it was late, and they both needed time to process the day's revelations. Tomorrow would be soon enough to begin building their partnership in earnest. The question that followed Blake to his own room, however, remained unanswered. Was this unexpected connection with Ellie merely strategic convenience, or the beginning of something neither of them had anticipated when they reluctantly spoke their vows? Morning arrived with the distant lowing of cattle and the rich aroma of coffee wafting through the East Wing. Blake woke earlier than usual, his mind already racing with plans and possibilities that had crystallized during the night. The revelations of the previous day had transformed his perspective. His unwanted marriage now represented an unexpected opportunity to reshape both families' legacies. He dressed quickly in work clothes rather than the business attire Harrison preferred, determined to maintain his usual ranch routines despite the extraordinary circumstances. When he entered the kitchen, He was surprised to find Ellie already there, similarly dressed for ranch work and engaged in conversation with Lisa and Miguel, the Thompsons' longtime groundskeeper. The irrigation system in the South Garden isn't as efficient as it could be, Ellie was saying, sketching something on a notepad. A drip system here and here would reduce water usage by at least 30% while improving plant health. Miguel leaned over her drawing with evident interest. I've been saying the same thing for years, but Mrs. Thompson prefers the traditional sprinklers. Perhaps we could set up a test area, Ellie suggested. Demonstrate the results before proposing a full conversion. Good morning, Blake interrupted, intrigued by this glimpse of Ellie seamlessly integrating herself into the household operations. All three looked up, with Lisa and Miguel straightening slightly at his presence, while Ellie merely offered a warm smile. Blake, Miguel was just showing me the gardens and explaining some of the water management challenges. Mrs. Thompson has excellent ideas, Miguel added, respect evident in his tone. Very practical. Blake poured himself coffee, noting how quickly Ellie had earned the staff's approval, something his mother had never quite managed in all her years at the ranch. I'm not surprised. Ellie has a gift for seeing possibilities others miss. Their eyes met briefly over his coffee mug, the double meaning of his words hanging between them. Something subtle shifted in her expression. Appreciation, perhaps, for his acknowledgement of her capabilities. I thought we might review those expansion projections this morning, Blake continued casually, unless you had other plans. That sounds perfect, Ellie replied. I was hoping to understand more about your vision for the eastern section. After breakfast, they retreated to Blake's study with a legitimate reason that would satisfy any curious observers, including Harrison, who had nodded approvingly when Blake mentioned their plans to review the Eastern expansion documents. Your father seems pleased that we're working together, Ellie observed once the door closed behind them. He thinks I'm making the best of the situation by utilizing your agricultural expertise, Blake replied, retrieving folders from his desk drawer. Which isn't wrong, just incomplete. The best deceptions always contain significant truth, Ellie noted, taking a seat at the small conference table that occupied one corner of the study. Speaking of which, I've been thinking about our approach to the oil situation. Blake spread the expansion plans across the table, but kept his attention on Ellie. I'm listening. We need more information before we can develop a comprehensive plan, she said, absently touching her mask as she organized her thoughts. Specifically, we need an updated geological survey that precisely maps the deposit's boundaries and depth, and an environmental impact assessment focusing on the aquifer protection. Both require bringing in outside experts, Blake pointed out, which risks alerting my father that we're investigating something beyond standard ranch operations. Ellie nodded. That's why I think we should incorporate it into your Eastern expansion planning. The groundwater study you already proposed for assessing irrigation potential could easily be expanded to include deeper geological assessments without raising suspicions. Blake studied her with growing admiration. Using my existing project as cover, that's clever. It also gives us legitimate reason to meet with environmental consultants who can advise on responsible extraction methods, Ellie continued, all framed as due diligence for your sustainable ranching initiative, which protects us from my father's interference because he's already granted me autonomy over the Eastern project, Blake concluded, appreciating the elegant strategy. This could work. They spent the next hour reviewing the actual expansion plans, with Ellie offering insights that genuinely improved Blake's original vision. Her suggestions about drought-resistant forage varieties and innovative water conservation techniques were exactly the kind of expertise he needed. Their professional collaboration, providing perfect cover for their broader conspiracy. These projection models are impressive, Ellie commented, studying the financial spreadsheets Blake had developed. You've accounted for variables most ranchers overlook. I learned from watching my father's mistakes, Blake admitted. Harrison's always been focused on quick returns rather than long-term sustainability. It's made Thompson cattle profitable, but created problems we're still addressing. Overgrazing, water quality issues, soil depletion. That's the fundamental tension here, isn't it? Ellie observed, between immediate profit and generational stewardship. Exactly. And it's the same tension we'll face with the oil deposit, Blake agreed. Conventional development would maximize short-term returns, but potentially create environmental problems that last centuries. Their discussion was interrupted by a knock. At the door, Blake quickly rearranged the papers to hide anything that might seem suspicious before calling, "Come in." Harrison entered, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene, his son and daughter-in-law surrounded by expansion plans, clearly deep in professional discussion. "I see you two are hard at work," he commented, his tone carefully neutral. "Find anything interesting in Blake's projections, Eleanor?" "Several things," Ellie replied without hesitation. "His rotational grazing model is particularly innovative. I was just suggesting some refinements based on research from my graduate studies." Harrison nodded slowly, his calculating gaze moving between them. "I'm pleased to see you taking such interest in ranch operations. Many women in your position would be more concerned with redecorating their new home." Blake tensed at the condescension in his father's tone, but Ellie merely smiled. "Different interests for different people, Mr. Thompson. I've always found agricultural science more compelling than interior design." "Clearly," Harrison replied, his eyes lingering briefly on her mask before returning to Blake. "I need you in the North Pasture this afternoon. The new bull delivery is arriving, and I want your assessment before we finalize payment." Of course, Blake agreed, recognizing both the legitimate request and his father's subtle reassertion of authority. "Ellie, would you like to join me? Your breeding expertise could be valuable." A flash of surprise crossed Harrison's face before he masked it. "That's not necessary. I'm sure Eleanor has other matters to attend to." "Actually, I'd be very interested," Ellie countered smoothly. "Cattle genetics was one of my research focuses at A&M, unless you'd prefer I not participate, Mr. Thompson." The challenge was subtle, but unmistakable. Harrison found himself in the awkward position of either explicitly excluding his new daughter-in-law or accepting her involvement in what had traditionally been male-dominated ranch business. "By all means," he finally conceded with a tight smile. "Two expert opinions are better than one. The delivery is expected at 2. After Harrison departed, Blake turned to Ellie with newfound respect. That was masterfully handled. "Your father expects demure compliance," she replied, a hint of steel beneath her calm exterior. "It's better to establish boundaries early in any relationship," Blake laughed softly. "I've known him my entire life and rarely managed to outmaneuver him that effectively." "You have history that complicates things," Ellie observed, returning her attention to the expansion documents. "I have the advantage of being new to the dynamic." They continued their work until lunch, developing both the legitimate expansion plans and, in carefully coded language, their strategy for investigating the oil deposit. By the time they joined Caroline in the dining room, they had established a clear timeline and division of responsibilities that would appear entirely focused on sustainable ranching to any outside observer. Caroline seemed surprised by their animated discussion of agricultural techniques, but made valiant attempts to participate. "I understand you'll be joining Blake and Harrison to evaluate the new breeding stock this afternoon," she commented to Ellie. "That's unusual." "Ellie has significant expertise in cattle genetics," Blake explained, before Ellie could respond. "Her input will be valuable." "Of course," Caroline replied, though her expression suggested she found the situation perplexing. Will you be attending the chamber dinner on Thursday as well, Eleanor? I need to confirm numbers today. Blake glanced at Ellie, silently communicating that the decision was hers. Yes, I will, Ellie decided after a moment's consideration. It seems an appropriate opportunity to meet the local business community. Caroline's relief was palpable. Wonderful. I've taken the liberty of scheduling a fitting with my dressmaker tomorrow. For the event, she added, her eyes flickering to Ellie's mask. That's very thoughtful, Ellie replied evenly, though I do have suitable formal wear already. I'm sure you do, dear, Caroline said with the slightly patronizing tone of a woman who believed no one from outside her social circle could possibly understand proper attire. But Madame Josephine is simply the best in the region. She can also help with accessories that might complement your situation. Blake winced at his mother's clumsy attempt at tact, but Ellie remained composed. Thank you for the suggestion, Mrs. Thompson. I'll consider it. The remainder of lunch passed in strained conversation until Blake finally excused them both to prepare for the afternoon's livestock evaluation. As they walked toward the stables, he finally addressed the tension. I apologize for my mother. She means well, but lacks subtlety. No need to apologize, Ellie assured him. I've encountered far worse attempts to fix my appearance. At least your mother's approach was well-intentioned, if misguided. Still, you shouldn't have to manage other people's discomfort with your choices. Ellie stopped walking, turning to face him directly. Is that what you think this is? A choice? The question hung between them, charged with unspoken history. Blake carefully considered his response. Whatever led to the mask being necessary, continuing to wear it in the face of social pressure demonstrates remarkable strength. That part, at least, seems like a choice, and one I respect. Something in Ellie's posture eased slightly. Thank you for that. Most people assume I'm either hiding something shameful or seeking attention. I've learned you don't do anything without good reason, Blake replied simply. The moment was interrupted by Riley approaching with horses already saddled for their ride to the north pasture. Thunderbolt for you, Mr. Blake, and I thought Mrs. Thompson might prefer Daisy again. She seemed to take care of her yesterday. Perfect, Riley, thank you, Ellie said warmly, moving toward the gentle mare who nickered in apparent recognition. The ride to the north pasture took them through some of the most beautiful sections of Thompson land, rolling hills dotted with mature oak trees, expanses of native grasses shimmering in the afternoon sun, clear streams cutting through occasional ravines. Blake found himself seeing the familiar landscape through new eyes, imagining how it appeared to Ellie and feeling an unexpected pride in his family's stewardship, despite his criticisms of his father's methods. This is truly magnificent country, Ellie commented, echoing his thoughts as they crested a hill that provided a panoramic view. Different from Prescott land, more varied in terrain and vegetation. The diversity makes management more challenging, but provides resilience, Blake explained. Different zones can thrive under different conditions, so we rarely face total failure even in drought years. Smart design, whether intentional or accidental, Ellie observed. A bit of both. My grandfather had an intuitive understanding of ecological principles before they had scientific names. He purchased parcels specifically to create a connected system of different landscapes. They arrived at the north pasture holding pens to find Harrison already there with Vince Martinez, the ranch foreman, and a trailer containing 3 impressive bulls. The animals were being unloaded with careful precision into separate evaluation pens. Right on time, Harrison acknowledged their arrival. The Hereford and 1 Angus are for the main herd improvement program. The 2nd Angus is specifically selected for the Eastern expansion genetics you requested, Blake. Blake dismounted, surprised by his father's apparent support of his breeding preferences for the expansion project. I appreciate that. Don't thank me yet, Harrison cautioned. The price premium for those specific genetics was substantial. I expect results to justify the investment." As they approached the pens, Blake noticed Harrison watching Ellie with barely concealed skepticism as she dismounted and moved confidently toward the animals. Vince, the foreman, looked equally uncertain about her presence in what had traditionally been an all-male evaluation process. "Mrs. Thompson," Vince nodded politely, if stiffly. "Blake mentioned you have experience with breeding stock." "I do," Ellie confirmed, approaching the nearest pen without hesitation. "This Hereford has excellent conformation. Quality bloodlines, I assume?" "Rockford champion lineage," Harrison replied, his tone suggesting he was testing her knowledge. "Thought so. I recognize the distinctive shoulder structure and head profile," Ellie commented, moving to study the animal from different angles. "Good choice for improving meat-to-bone ratio in your existing herd." Blake suppressed a smile at the barely concealed surprise on both his father's and Vince's faces. Ellie's assessment was precisely accurate and demonstrated knowledge only someone truly versed in cattle breeding would possess. The evaluation continued, with Ellie offering insightful observations about each animal, occasionally asking penetrating questions about genetic testing results and performance metrics that even Blake hadn't thought to request. By the time they finished examining the third bull, Harrison's attitude had shifted noticeably from skepticism to reluctant respect. "Your assessment aligns with the breeder's claims," he finally acknowledged. "Vince, process the payment and get these boys settled into their adaptation pens." As Vince moved to handle the administrative details, Harrison turned to Blake and, "Ellie, I have to admit, Eleanor, your expertise is impressive. Miles never mentioned your level of involvement in the Prescott breeding program. Dad preferred to present me in certain ways to potential business partners," Ellie replied diplomatically. "My operational role at the ranch wasn't something he emphasized." Harrison's eyes narrowed slightly, reassessing her with the calculating gaze Blake knew well, the look his father got when recalibrating his understanding of an asset or opportunity. "Perhaps we've been underutilizing your capabilities," Harrison mused. "Blake mentioned you'll be joining us at the chamber dinner Thursday. I'd like you to meet some of our key business associates." "I look forward to it," Ellie replied smoothly. Though Blake detected a hint of wariness beneath her polite response, they rode back to the main house together, Harrison unusually talkative as he detailed the Thompson breeding program's history and future goals. Blake remained mostly silent, observing the shifting dynamic between his father and wife with fascination. Harrison Thompson rarely changed his assessment of people, yet Ellie had managed to force a re-evaluation in less than 48 hours. When they reached the stables, Harrison excused himself for a business call, leaving Blake and Ellie to unsaddle their horses together. "That went better than expected," Blake commented quietly as they worked. "Your father values competence above most things," Ellie observed, removing Daisy's saddle with practiced ease. Once he saw evidence of mine, his attitude adjusted accordingly. "Don't underestimate him," Blake warned. "He's reassessing your value to Thompson cattle, not necessarily respecting you as a person." "I'm counting on that," Ellie replied with a slight smile. "The more he sees me as a valuable asset rather than just your wife, the more access I'll have to information and influence we need." Blake paused in brushing down Thunderbolt, struck again by her strategic thinking. "You've planned this carefully, haven't you? Gradually reveal your expertise to gain his confidence. When you've spent years being underestimated because of this," she gestured toward her mask, "you learn to use people's assumptions to your advantage." As they finished caring for the horses, Blake found himself increasingly drawn to Ellie's complex blend of vulnerability and strength, principle and pragmatism. Their arranged marriage had begun as a business transaction, but was evolving into something neither could have anticipated: a genuine partnership based on shared values and complementary skills. That evening, dinner conversation centered on the chamber event. With Carolyn explaining the complex social hierarchy Blake knew Ellie would be expected to navigate. "The Prestons will certainly want to meet you," Caroline explained. "Their daughter married into the Henderson shipping family last year, quite the advantageous connection. And the Whitfields control most of the agricultural banking in the region. So Harrison will want you both to spend time at their table." "I'm familiar with regional business networks," Ellie assured her. "My father may have preferred traditional roles, but he did ensure I understood the importance of relationships in the industry." "Of course, dear," Caroline replied with the same slightly condescending tone she'd used at lunch, "but Thompson events operate at a different level than what you might be accustomed to from Prescott gatherings." Blake intervened before the conversation could become more awkward. "Mother, Ellie has attended agricultural conferences across the country. I'm sure she'll manage a local chamber dinner without difficulty." The subtle rebuke silenced Caroline temporarily, though her expression suggested she remained unconvinced of her new daughter-in-law's social readiness. Later that night, Blake found himself unable to sleep, his mind racing with the day's developments and the complex game they were now playing. The stakes were enormous, not just the oil wealth, but the environmental future of the region and both families' legacies. A soft knock at his door startled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, Ellie stood in the hallway, still fully dressed. "Despite the late hour, I'm sorry to disturb you," she said quietly. "But I've been thinking about our timeline, and there's something we need to discuss that couldn't wait until morning." Blake stepped back, inviting her into his room with a gesture, crossing a boundary that suddenly seemed both significant and natural. "What is it?" Ellie entered, her expression troubled behind her mask. "I received a call from my father's doctor while you were meeting with Harrison this evening. Dad's condition has deteriorated more rapidly than expected. They're giving him weeks now, not months, weeks," Blake repeated, processing the gravity of this development. "That changes everything." Ellie nodded, her composed exterior showing small cracks of genuine distress. "We don't have the luxury of the timeline we discussed earlier. If my father passes, before we have our plans in place, Harrison will move quickly to assert control." Blake finished her thought, gesturing for her to sit in one of the armchairs by the window. "How certain is the prognosis? Dr. Winters has been treating Dad for over a year. He's been conservative in his estimates until now." Ellie sank into the chair, the weight of the situation evident in her posture. "The cancer has spread to his liver. They're transitioning him to palliative care only." Blake poured water from the carafe on his nightstand, handing her a glass before taking the opposite chair. The intimacy of the late-night conversation in his bedroom wasn't lost on him, but the urgency of their situation overshadowed any awkwardness. "We need to accelerate everything," he said after a moment's consideration. "The environmental assessment, the updated geological survey, all of it. Can we arrange it that quickly without alerting your father?" Ellie asked, her voice steady despite her evident concern. Blake leaned forward, mind racing through possibilities. "I have contacts at Tech Soil Environmental from previous ranch projects. They're discreet and can prioritize assessments if the price is right." He paused, considering. "But we'll need funding that won't trigger Harrison's oversight." "I have access to a separate account my grandfather established," Ellie offered. "Dad never touched it, considering it my dowry of sorts. Ironic, given the circumstances." "How much are we talking about?" "Nearly 200,000. Not enough for large-scale development, but sufficient for the preliminary assessments we need." Blake nodded, impressed once again by her foresight. "That should cover comprehensive testing and give us leverage to negotiate with potential development partners on our terms." "I'll need to visit the Prescott Ranch tomorrow," Ellie said. "Check on my father and access some documentation we'll need." Would that raise suspicions if I went alone? Not if we frame it right. Blake considered their options. I could accompany you, tell my parents we're collecting some of your research materials relevant to the Eastern expansion. Harrison would find that plausible given your performance today. Relief flickered across Ellie's visible features. Thank you. I'd appreciate the support. Dad might not recognize me. It happened last time I visited. The admission carried more weight than her composed tone suggested. Blake reached across the space between them, briefly touching her hand in a gesture of comfort that surprised them both. I'm sorry, Ellie, about all of it. She didn't pull away from the contact, her gaze holding him for a moment that stretched beyond mere alliance into something more personal. Thank you for understanding what's at stake, for treating me as a partner. You've more than proven yourself worthy of that respect, Blake replied honestly. A comfortable silence settled between them, the night sounds of the ranch filtering through the partially open window, distant cattle, the occasional calling of nightbirds, the whisper of wind through oak leaves. For the first time since their hasty wedding, Blake felt a sense of genuine connection forming, not just strategic alignment, but something more fundamental. I should let you rest, Ellie finally said, rising from her chair. We have an early start tomorrow if we're visiting the Prescott Ranch. Blake stood as well. I'll make the arrangements. We'll leave after breakfast. At the door, Ellie paused, her hand resting on the doorframe. Blake, whatever happens with my father, with the oil, with all of it, I'm grateful this arrangement brought us together, even under these circumstances. The simple sincerity of her words caught him off guard. So am I, he found himself responding with equal honesty. After she left, Blake stood at his window for a long while, watching the moon cast silver light across the Texas landscape. The situation remained complicated, the challenges substantial, but for the first time since his father had announced the arranged marriage, he felt genuine hope for the future. Not just for the land and the business, but for himself. Morning arrived with scattered rain showers that left the air fresh and cool by Texas summer standards. Blake arranged for Riley to prepare the ranch truck rather than horses for their journey to the Prescott property, citing efficiency given the weather and their need to transport documents. Caroline appeared concerned at breakfast when they announced their plans. Is it appropriate to visit your father so soon after the wedding, Eleanor? People might talk. People always talk, Mrs. Thompson, Ellie replied easily. But I need to check on his condition and collect some research materials relevant to Blake's expansion project. Besides, Blake added, the Chronicle article has already made our marriage public. There's nothing scandalous about visiting an ailing father. Harrison, surprisingly, supported their trip. It's a good opportunity to assess the Prescott livestock up close, he noted pragmatically, and showing unified family concern for Miles can only strengthen our position in the community. The 40-minute drive to Prescott Ranch revealed much about the differences between the two operations. Where Thompson land was expansive and diverse, the Prescott property was more compact and intensively managed. The main house, a single-story, ranch-style home built in the 1970s, lacked the grandeur of the Thompson estate, but possessed a comfortable, lived-in quality that Blake found immediately appealing. Mattie Simmons, the nurse now providing full-time care for Miles Prescott, greeted them at the door with evident relief. He's having one of his better mornings, she informed Ellie quietly, recognized me right away and asked about the cattle count from yesterday. That's encouraging, Ellie replied, though her tone suggested she'd learned not to place too much hope in temporary improvements. Mattie, this is my husband, Blake Thompson. The nurse appraised Blake with frank curiosity. Good to meet you, Mr. Thompson. Ellie's daddy has been asking about you. This surprised both of them. He remembers the wedding, Blake asked. In his way, Mattie hedged. Some days are clearer than others. Best to follow his lead when you talk. To him. Miles Prescott was propped up in a hospital bed that had been installed in what was clearly once his home office. Large windows provided a view of grazing land and the distant barn complex. Despite the evident weight loss and pallor that marked serious illness, the old rancher maintained an aura of dignity and determination. "There she is," Miles called as Ellie entered. His voice weaker, but still carrying the authoritative tone Blake remembered from their brief interactions. "Bring your new husband to show him around, did you?" "Yes, Dad." Ellie approached the bed, leaning down to kiss his cheek. Blake wanted to see the Prescott operation up close. Miles turned his attention to Blake, his gaze surprisingly sharp. "You're treating my girl right, Thompson?" "I'm doing my best, sir," Blake replied honestly, stepping forward to shake the older man's outstretched hand, noting its frailty despite the firm grip. Still got that mask on, I see," Miles commented to Ellie, "though maybe being married might change your mind about that." Blake felt Ellie tense beside him, but her voice remained gentle. "We've discussed this before, Dad. The mask stays." "Your choice, I suppose. Always was stubborn." Miles shifted his attention back to Blake. "Your father thinks he got the better end of our deal, son." The direct question caught Blake off guard. "I believe he's satisfied with the arrangement," he answered carefully. Miles laughed, the sound dissolving into a brief coughing spell that Matty quickly helped him manage. When he recovered, a knowing gleam lit his eyes. "Course he is. Harrison Thompson never makes a bad deal. Or so he thinks." Blake exchanged a glance with Ellie, uncertain how to interpret this comment given Miles' cognitive state. Was this just rambling, or did the old rancher understand more than they'd assumed? "Dad, I need to collect some research materials from my office," Ellie said, "and check on a few ranch matters. Will you be all right with Blake for a few minutes?" "I've faced tougher company," Miles quipped. "Go on with your business. Boy and I will get acquainted." When Ellie had left with a concerned backward glance, Miles gestured for Blake to sit in the chair beside the bed. "She told you yet about what's under the south pasture?" Blake's pulse quickened. "You mean the oil deposit?" "So she did tell you." Miles nodded with apparent satisfaction. "Good. Needs someone with sense to help her manage what's coming." "You knew she was aware of the survey results?" Blake asked, reassessing everything he'd understood about the situation. Miles reached for the water glass on his bedside table, his hand trembling slightly. "Course I knew. Girls can't hide much from me, mask or no mask. Saw the papers in her desk when looking for my medication list." His eyes, despite the illness clouding them, fixed on Blake with surprising clarity. "Question is, whose side are you on, boy? Your father's or the land's?" The distinction struck Blake as profound in its simplicity. "The land, sir, always has been." Miles studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Maybe I underestimated you then. Thought you were just another Thompson suit playing cowboy when convenient." "Many people make that mistake," Blake replied without rancor. "Ellie didn't," Miles observed. "Said you understood stewardship in ways your father never will." He leaned back against his pillows, fatigue evident in his features. "I'm not long for this world, Thompson. Cancer's seen to that. But I'll die easier knowing my Eleanor found an ally, not just a husband." The use of Ellie's full name carried weight, reminding Blake that despite their complex dynamic, Miles genuinely cared for his daughter in his own way. "I give you my word, Mr. Prescott. We'll protect the land and the water, whatever it takes." "Good." Miles' eyes drifted toward the window, toward the land his family had worked for generations. "Your father thinks he bought himself an oil field, with some cattle thrown in. Let him keep thinking that until you're ready." Before Blake could probe further, Matty returned to check Miles' vital signs, and the moment of clarity seemed to pass. By the time Ellie returned, carrying a leather portfolio and several computer drives, her father had drifted into a light sleep. "Did he stay lucid?" she asked quietly as they prepared to leave. "Remarkably so." Blake confirmed, waiting until they were outside to elaborate. He knows about the oil, Ellie, and he knows that you know. She stopped beside the truck, surprise evident in her posture. That's impossible. I never told him. He found the survey papers on your desk, and from what he said, he approves of you. Keeping it from Harrison and developing a protection strategy. Ellie leaned against the vehicle, processing this revelation. All this time, I thought I was protecting him from knowledge that would only distress him in his condition. While he thought the same about you, Blake concluded. He's proud of you, Ellie. That much was clear, despite everything. The drive back to the Thompson ranch was quieter, both of them contemplating this shift in their understanding. Blake found himself increasingly curious about the dynamics of the Prescott family, the complicated relationship between father and daughter that seemed to mirror his own with Harrison in many ways. Your father mentioned your mask, he finally said, broaching the subject carefully. It seemed like an ongoing point of contention between you. Ellie continued watching the landscape pass outside her window for several moments before responding. Dad never understood my decision to wear it. He saw it as giving power to what happened, rather than moving beyond it. Blake kept his eyes on the road, sensing she might say more if not directly observed. And you see it differently. I see it as reclaiming power, she replied, her voice steady. Making a visible choice, rather than having others define me by their reactions to what they see. The distinction was profound, revealing more about Ellie's character than any direct explanation of the mask's purpose could have. Whatever lay beneath the covering, her choice to wear it represented strength rather than concealment, a declaration of self-determination that Blake found himself respecting even more deeply. They arrived back at the Thompson ranch to find Harrison waiting for them in the main office, surrounded by maps and documents. His expression was uncharacteristically animated. Perfect timing, he greeted them, barely acknowledging their return, beyond a cursory nod. I've been reviewing the Eastern Section plans and had some thoughts about accelerating the timeline. Blake exchanged a quick glance with Ellie, wary of his father's sudden interest in a project he'd previously dismissed as Blake's pet initiative. What kind of acceleration? I've been speaking with Westridge Resource Partners about potential natural gas exploration in the region, Harrison replied, spreading a geological survey map across his desk. Their preliminary assessments suggest the formation might extend into our new acquisition. The mention of Westridge, a company known for aggressive extraction techniques with minimal environmental safeguards, sent a jolt of alarm through Blake. Since when are we considering energy development on Thompson land? Since it became financially prudent, Harrison replied smoothly. The cattle market projections for next year are concerning. Diversification is simply good business. Westridge doesn't exactly have a sterling environmental record, Blake pointed out, struggling to keep his tone neutral. Their last 3 projects resulted in significant groundwater contamination. Harrison's expression hardened slightly. They've updated their processes since those incidents. Besides, the potential returns could fund your Eastern expansion project twice over. At what cost to the land and water? Blake challenged. Always the idealist. Harrison sighed, his gaze shifting to Ellie. Perhaps your new wife can offer a more balanced perspective, given her academic background. What do you think about natural gas development, Eleanor? Properly managed, of course. The question was a trap, and they both knew it. Harrison was testing Ellie's alignment with Blake's environmental concerns, or with the broader Thompson business interests Harrison represented. I think, Ellie replied carefully, that any resource development decision should be preceded by comprehensive environmental impact assessment, particularly regarding aquifer protection. The economic benefits could indeed be substantial, but only if extraction methods prioritize long-term land viability. Her diplomatic response seemed to satisfy Harrison while avoiding direct opposition. Reasonable perspective, which is why I've arranged for Westridge's assessment team to visit next week. They'll conduct preliminary testing to determine viability. Next week, Blake repeated, alarm rising. That's moving awfully fast for a direction we've never seriously discussed. The market waits for no one, Harrison replied dismissively. Besides, it's only a preliminary assessment. No commitments yet. The yet hung in the air like a promise or a threat. Blake recognized his father's tactics from countless previous business maneuvers. Create momentum toward his preferred outcome, present it as inevitable, and steamroll any opposition with the appearance of reasonableness. I'd like to review their proposed testing protocols before they arrive, Blake said, fighting to maintain his composure. And I want our own environmental consultant present during any testing. Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. That seems unnecessarily adversarial for a preliminary survey. It's due diligence, Blake countered. If we're considering this direction, we should understand exactly what we're getting into from the beginning. After a tense moment, Harrison nodded curtly. Fine, have whoever you want present. But this is happening, Blake. The agricultural landscape is changing, and Thompson Cattle needs to change with it. When they finally escaped Harrison's office, Blake led Ellie directly to the stables, where they could speak privately, while ostensibly checking on the horses. The physical activity of brushing Thunderbolt helped channel Blake's agitation as he processed this unexpected development. "This complicates everything," he said quietly, ensuring no stable hands were within earshot. "If Westridge conducts testing, they'll discover the oil deposit that extends from Prescott Land." "Sooner than we planned," Ellie agreed, her own hands moving methodically over Daisy's coat. "But perhaps we can use this to our advantage." Blake paused his brushing. "How?" "Your father is focused on natural gas. If Westridge discovers oil instead, it changes the negotiation entirely." Ellie's eyes met his, calculation evident in her gaze. "We could use the surprise factor to delay any immediate action while we position our own environmental protection plan. That's assuming Westridge would prioritize oil over gas," Blake pointed out. "They're equally happy to extract either." "True, but different resources require different extraction methods and permits," Ellie countered. "The regulatory process for oil drilling near an aquifer is more stringent than for natural gas in this county. It would buy us time." Blake considered this angle, impressed by her quick, strategic thinking. "We still need our own assessment completed before they arrive. Can you access your grandfather's account quickly?" "First thing tomorrow," Ellie promised. "I'll contact the bank and arrange the transfer." Their conversation was interrupted by Lisa appearing at the stable entrance. "There you are. Mrs. Thompson, Madame Josephine has arrived for your fitting. Mrs. Caroline is quite insistent that you not keep her waiting." Ellie suppressed a sigh. "Please tell Mrs. Thompson I'll be there." Momentarily, when Lisa had departed, Blake shook his head in frustration. "The chamber dinner seems trivial compared to what we're facing, but maintaining appearances is crucial right now. We can't afford to raise Harrison's suspicions by bucking too many social conventions at once." "I understand," Ellie assured him. "I'll endure Madame Josephine and her inevitable comments about complimenting my unique feature while you reach out to tech soil. The sooner we have our own data, the stronger our position." As they walked back toward the house, Blake found himself struck by the absurdity of their situation. Forced into marriage as pawns in their father's business machinations, now united in a secret effort to outmaneuver both families' expectations, while preparing for a high-stakes confrontation with a resource extraction company. Yet beneath the strategic alliance, something else was growing. A genuine respect and affection that neither had anticipated. Blake found himself increasingly drawn to Ellie's resilience, intelligence, and principled determination. The mask that had once seemed her defining feature now barely registered in his awareness, except as a symbol of her strength. "Whatever happens, next week," he said as they reached the garden path where they would separate, "we face it together." Ellie's hand briefly touched his arm, the gesture conveying more than words could. "Partners," she agreed softly. The simple affirmation carried weight beyond their immediate challenges, a recognition that whatever had brought them together, their connection now represented something neither had expected to find: genuine understanding and acceptance without conditions or pretense. As Ellie headed toward her dreaded fitting and Blake toward his office to contact environmental consultants, neither could have anticipated how quickly their tenuous plans would be tested, or how the truth behind Ellie's mask would soon change everything between them. The Chamber of Commerce dinner arrived with oppressive formality, the grand ballroom of the Westland Hotel transformed into a showcase of regional wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over tables adorned with elaborate floral arrangements, while Texas's agricultural and business elite circulated in designer evening wear, exchanging pleasantries that masked competitive calculation. Blake adjusted his tie, uncomfortable in the formal suit, despite having worn similar attire countless times for Thompson business functions. Tonight felt different, more consequential. Across the room, Harrison moved confidently between conversation groups, occasionally gesturing toward Blake and Ellie as he undoubtedly extolled the virtues of their union to potential business partners. "He's certainly making the most of our marriage," Ellie observed quietly beside him. She looked striking in a midnight blue gown that Madame Josephine had indeed designed to complement her mask. A slightly more elaborate version crafted from the same material as her dress, embellished with subtle silver embroidery. "To Harrison, everything is a business opportunity," Blake replied, "even family." "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," a smooth voice interrupted. They turned to find James Westridge approaching, champagne flute in hand. The CEO of Westridge Resource Partners was younger than Blake expected, perhaps 40, with the tailored appearance of new money trying to fit into old money circles. "I've been looking forward to meeting you both. Your father speaks highly of your ranch management innovations, Blake." Blake shook the offered hand with carefully concealed reluctance. "Mr. Westridge, I understand your team will be visiting our property next week." "Indeed, we're quite excited about the potential partnership." Westridge's attention shifted to Ellie, his eyes briefly registering her mask before politely focusing on her visible features. "And Mrs. Thompson, Harrison mentioned your agricultural science background, an unusual specialization for a rancher's daughter. No more unusual than environmental engineering would be for an oil executive's son," Ellie replied smoothly, referencing Westridge's own background with subtle precision. Westridge's smile tightened momentarily before recovering. "Taché, I see Harrison has acquired not just water rights but sharp intellect through this merger." He turned back to Blake. "Our preliminary research suggests significant potential in the eastern section. We're particularly interested in the geological formation that extends beneath the shared aquifer with Prescott Land." Blake maintained his neutral expression with effort. "We're equally interested in protecting that aquifer. I trust your assessment will include comprehensive water safety protocols." Of course," Westridge assured him with practiced ease. "Environmental stewardship is a top priority at WRP. You'll find our new extraction methods quite innovative in minimizing impact. We look forward to reviewing those innovations in detail," Ellie interjected, "particularly regarding long-term monitoring of potential contaminant migration." Something flickered in Westridge's eyes, a momentary reassessment, as he recognized that the conversation would not be as straightforward as Harrison might have led him to believe. "I'm sure our technical team will be happy to address any concerns. If you'll excuse me, I see the Hendersons waving me over." When he departed, Blake and Ellie exchanged a meaningful glance. He knows more than he's letting on, Blake murmured. And Harrison has clearly been laying groundwork for this partnership for some time, Ellie added. Westridge specifically mentioned the formation extending beneath Prescott Land. That's not something he would know without detailed geological survey data. The implications were disturbing. Had Harrison somehow acquired information about the oil deposit before orchestrating the marriage? Was the water rights merger merely a convenient cover for the real prize? Before they could discuss further, Caroline approached with a small group of society women in tow, each eyeing Ellie with poorly disguised curiosity. "Eleanor, dear, Mrs. Whitfield has been so eager to meet you. Her garden club provides arrangements for all the major charity events in the county." The next hour dissolved into a parade of introductions, each interaction requiring careful navigation of social expectations while maintaining their united front. Blake watched with growing admiration as Ellie handled probing questions and barely veiled comments about her mask with graceful deflection, never allowing herself to be diminished or defined by others' curiosity. It was nearing midnight when they finally escaped, the Texas night warm and star-filled as they walked to their car in blessed silence. Blake loosened his tie with a sigh of relief. "You were remarkable there. Even the Whitfields were won over by the end." "Years of practice," Ellie replied, slipping off her high heels to walk barefoot across the parking lot, the simple action speaking to a level of comfort between them that had developed with surprising speed. "Though I must admit, your mother's social circle is particularly persistent in their investigation techniques. They've elevated gossip gathering to an art form," Blake agreed wryly. "But you've given them something new to consider. A Thompson wife with her own mind and expertise." The drive home was companionable, their conversation shifting to the upcoming Westridge assessment and their counter-strategy. Tech Soil Environmental had agreed to conduct their own testing the following day, giving them crucial independent data. Before Westridge's team arrived, as they approached the Thompson Ranch entrance, Blake slowed the car unexpectedly, turning onto a narrow side road that wound up toward a hilltop overlooking the property. "Where are we going?" Ellie asked, curious, rather than concerned. "Somewhere I think you might appreciate," Blake replied, continuing along the unpaved track until they reached a clearing at the crest of the hill. The view was spectacular. The entire Thompson Ranch spread out below them, moonlight silvering the landscape into a tapestry of fields, forests, and waterways. In the far distance, the lights of the Prescott homestead were just visible, a reminder of their connected futures. "My grandfather brought me here when I was 8, Blake explained, turning off the engine. "Told me that whenever ranch decisions felt overwhelming, I should come up here to remember what I was really responsible for. Not profit margins or headcounts, but this," he gestured toward the vista, "the land itself and everyone who depends on it." "It's beautiful," Ellie said softly, her gaze taking in the expansive view. "Thank you for sharing it with me." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the enormity of their task somehow more manageable when viewed from this perspective. "Blake," Ellie finally said, her voice holding a new note of resolution, "there's something I need to show you, something you deserve to know before we go any further with our plans." He turned toward her, recognizing the significance of the moment. "You don't have to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted gently. "This partnership we've formed, it requires complete trust, and that means no more secrets between us." With steady hands, she reached up and slowly removed the mask that had defined her in the eyes of others for so long. Blake found himself holding his breath, not from apprehension about what might be revealed, but from awareness of the profound trust she was placing in him. The moonlight illuminated her face clearly, revealing not a disfiguring scar as he had been led to expect, but unblemished skin on one side and an intricate pattern on the other, geometric lines and swirls in deep blue-black, extending from her temple down her cheek to her jawline. "It's a traditional Maori tamoko," she explained, watching his reaction carefully. "My mother was from New Zealand, from the Ngati Poro iwi. This design tells the story of her lineage and mine." "It's beautiful," Blake said honestly, understanding. "Dawn. But why hide it behind a mask?" Ellie completed his thought. "When I first received it at 16, as part of connecting with my mother's heritage after her death, the reactions were difficult. My father was horrified, not because of how it looked, but because of how others treated me. In the conservative Texas ranching community, the traditional marking made me an instant outsider." She traced the lines with her fingertips, the gesture clearly one of pride rather than shame. "The mask began as protection, not for me, but for others who couldn't see past their own discomfort. Over time, it became a test. Only people who respected me with the mask would truly value me without it." Blake understood with sudden clarity. "Including potential husbands your father might choose." "Exactly," Ellie nodded. "I knew anyone who married me, believing they were accepting a disfigured bride out of pity or business obligation, would reveal their true character in time. The mask let me observe without being truly seen. Until you decided someone was worthy of seeing the truth," Blake concluded, profoundly moved by her trust. "My heritage is central to who I am," Ellie continued. "My mother taught me that our connection to land isn't just about ownership. It's about responsibility to protect it for future generations. The oil discovery merely gave me the means to honor that teaching on a larger scale." The pieces fell into place for Blake. Her passionate commitment to environmental protection, her strategic patience, her willingness to enter an arranged marriage for the greater purpose of land stewardship. The values reflected in the tamoko weren't foreign to his own beliefs. They were the foundation of everything he'd been trying to achieve with the Eastern expansion. "Thank you," he said simply, "for trusting me with this." Ellie's smile, unrestricted by the mask for the first time, transformed her face with a radiance that took his breath away. "Partners should see each other clearly, don't you think?" The moment between them shifted, deepening into something neither had anticipated when they'd reluctantly spoken their wedding vows days earlier. Blake reached across the space between them, his hand gently tracing the intricate pattern on her cheek with a reverence that acknowledged its significance. "Partners," he agreed softly, the word now carrying meanings beyond their strategic alliance. As they sat together beneath the Texas stars, the challenges ahead remained formidable. Harrison's ambitions, Westridge's impending assessment, the accelerated timeline forced by Miles Prescott's declining health. But in that moment of genuine connection, something fundamental had changed. The cattle baron's son, who had been forced to wed a scarred woman for business reasons, now found himself grateful for the arrangement that had brought this remarkable woman into his life. The truth behind Ellie's mask hadn't exposed weakness or damage, but rather a depth of heritage, principle, and courage that mirrored his own deepest values. Their journey forward would not be easy, but they would face it together, not as reluctant pawns in their father's business machinations, but as true partners united by shared vision and growing affection. The land that had been intended to divide their families had instead become the foundation for a union neither could have imagined, but both now embraced with hope and determination. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.